I never thought the sound of my husband packing his suitcase would be the most heartbreaking melody I'd ever hear. The zipper closing felt like a funeral dirge, each fold of his clothes another nail in the coffin of our 23-year marriage. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom that would soon be just mine, watching the man I'd built my entire life around prepare to walk away. For her, for someone young enough to be our daughter, Sarah, please don't make this harder than it has to be, Michael said without looking at me, his voice carrying that familiar tone of exhaustion he'd perfected over the past 6 months. The same tone he used when discussing mortgage payments or parent-teacher conferences, mundane, obligatory, distant. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw myself at his feet and beg him not to leave. Instead, I gripped the door frame until my knuckles turned white and whispered, "How long have you been planning this?" He paused, a navy blue sweater, the one I'd bought him for Christmas 3 years ago, hanging limply in his hands. "It's not about planning, Sarah, it's about feeling alive again, feeling alive. As if our life together had been some kind of slow death. As if raising our 2 beautiful children, Emma and Jake, had been a prison sentence. As if building our home, our memories, our dreams had been nothing more than an elaborate tomb. And Jessica makes you feel alive?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded when everything inside me was crumbling. Finally, he turned to look at me. Michael's blue eyes, the same eyes that had looked at me with such love on our wedding day, the same eyes that had sparkled with joy when we brought our babies home from the hospital, now held nothing but pity. Pity for the woman who had loved him with every fiber of her being. "She's different," he said, as if that explained everything. "She sees possibilities where we see problems. She has dreams, Sarah, big dreams. And I don't?" The words escaped before I could stop them, carrying 23 years of sacrificed ambitions. 23 years of putting his career first, of moving cities for his promotions, of postponing my own dreams so he could chase his. Michael sighed. That same patronizing sigh he'd given me countless times over the past months. "You used to, but somewhere along the way you got comfortable with this." He gestured around our bedroom, our home, our life. "Jessica wants to travel the world. She wants to start a business. She wants to live, not just exist." Each word was a dagger. I had wanted to travel too once upon a time. I had dreams of opening my own art studio, of painting again like I did in college before marriage, and motherhood consumed every spare moment of creativity I possessed. But those dreams had been carefully folded away, placed in boxes in the attic along with my easel and paints, sacrificed on the altar of being a good wife, a devoted mother. "She's 26, Michael," I said quietly. "Of course she has dreams. She hasn't lived long enough to understand that sometimes love means sacrificing those dreams for something bigger than yourself." "That's exactly what I'm talking about," he said, his voice rising with frustration. "You've convinced yourself that sacrifice is love, that giving up everything you wanted is some noble act. Jessica doesn't think like that. She believes we can have it all." "Jessica doesn't think like that." The phrase echoed in my mind as I watched my husband, my Michael, defend a woman who had never missed a night's sleep with a teething baby, never worried about college tuition, never held her child's hand through a nightmare or a heartbreak. Jessica didn't think like that because Jessica had never been forced to think like that. "What about Emma and Jake?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Michael's face softened for just a moment, the first crack in his armor of indifference. "They're adults now, Sarah. Emma's got her life in Seattle. Jake's finishing his senior year. They don't need us the way they used to." "They don't need us," I repeated. "But they need their family. They need to know that love can last, that commitment means something." "They'll understand," he said. But I could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. Eventually, I watched him fold the last of his clothes, close the suitcase, and lift it from our bed. 23 years of marriage reduced to 2 suitcases and a cardboard box of personal items. I thought about all the times I'd packed suitcases for family vacations, carefully folding everyone's clothes with excitement for the adventures ahead. Now I was watching him pack to begin an adventure that didn't include me. "Where will you go?" I asked as he moved toward the door. "Jessica has a place downtown," he said, not meeting my eyes. "It's temporary until we figure things out." Until we figure things out. Even in leaving me, he couldn't commit fully. There was still a part of him, however small, that left room for doubt, for return, for the possibility that his midlife crisis might not be the fairy tale he imagined. I followed him downstairs, watching him move through our home like a stranger collecting borrowed items. He paused at the front door, his hand on the handle, and for a moment I thought he might turn around, might realize what he was throwing away. "Sarah, He started, then stopped. "I hope someday you'll understand that this isn't about you not being enough. It's about me needing to be more." And then he was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of his cologne and the echo of 23 years of memories. I stood in the hallway for what felt like hours, listening to the silence of the house settling around me. The grandfather clock in the living room, a wedding gift from Michael's parents, ticked steadily, marking time that now felt meaningless. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen where I'd prepared thousands of meals for my family. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked as the house adjusted to the absence of footsteps that would never return. The first night was the hardest. I lay in our king-sized bed, acutely aware of the empty space beside me where Michael's body had curved around mine for over 2 decades. I kept reaching for him in my half-sleep, my hand finding only cold sheets and the devastating reality of abandonment. I called in sick to work the next day. And the day after that. Jennifer, my boss at the nonprofit where I'd worked as a program coordinator for the past 8 years, was understanding but concerned. "Take all the time you need." "Sarah," she said when I finally called to explain. "But don't disappear completely. Sometimes keeping busy is the best medicine, but I didn't want medicine. I wanted to feel every ounce of the pain, to let it wash over me like a cleansing fire. I'd spent so many years being strong for everyone else. For Michael during his stressful periods at the law firm, for Emma when she struggled with anxiety in high school, for Jake when he tore his ACL and missed his senior football season. Now finally, I had permission to fall apart. I wandered through our house like a ghost, touching memories embedded in every corner. The dining room table where we'd shared thousands of family dinners, where Emma had done her homework while I helped her with math problems I barely understood myself. The living room couch where Michael and I had cuddled watching movies, where we'd argued about money and discipline and dreams deferred. The kitchen where I'd packed countless lunches, hosted birthday parties, and whispered late-night confessions over glasses of wine. It was in the kitchen that I found the letter. I'd been looking for the warranty, information for our dishwasher, a mundane task that felt oddly comforting in its normalcy when I discovered an envelope tucked behind a stack of manuals in the junk drawer. My name was written on the front in Michael's familiar handwriting, but the paper was yellowed with age, the edges soft from handling. Inside was a letter dated 15 years ago, written during a particularly difficult period in our marriage when Jake was 8 and Emma was 13. When money was tight and Michael was working 70-hour weeks trying to make partner at his firm. "My dearest Sarah, I know things have been hard lately. I know I've been absent, distracted, probably not the husband you deserve. I see how tired you are, how you carry the weight of our family while I chase ambitions that sometimes feel more important than they should. But I need you to know that everything I do, every hour I work, every sacrifice I make, it's all for you, for us, for the life we're building together. You are my anchor, my home, my reason for everything. When I'm stressed and overwhelmed, I think about coming home to you, to your smile, to the way you make everything feel possible. Emma told me yesterday that she wants to be like you when she grows up. Mommy makes everything okay, she said. And she's right. You do make everything okay, not just for our children, but for me too. I love you, Sarah. Not just for who you are, but for who you help me become. You make me want to be better, stronger, more worthy of the incredible woman who chose to build a life with me. I promise that no matter how crazy life gets, no matter what challenges we face, I will never forget how lucky I am to have you. You are my heart, my home, my forever, all my love. Michael. I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face, before I noticed the date again. 15 years ago. He had written this 15 years ago and kept it all this time, tucked away in our kitchen drawer like a secret promise to himself. What had changed? When had I stopped being his anchor and become his burden? When had my steadiness become stagnation in his eyes? When had my love become something to escape rather than something to cherish? I was still holding the letter when the phone rang. Emma's name appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment I considered not answering. I wasn't ready to explain to my daughter that her father had left, that our family was broken, that love apparently had an expiration date. "Hi, Mom." Emma's voice was bright and cheerful, calling from her apartment in Seattle where she worked as a graphic designer. "I just wanted to check in. Dad sounded weird when I talked to him yesterday." My heart clenched. He'd already talked to Emma. Had he told her about Jessica? About leaving? About throwing away everything we'd built together? "What did he say?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Nothing specific. He just seemed distant, I guess. More than usual." "Is everything okay?" I closed my eyes, gripping the phone like a lifeline. How do you tell your child that everything she believed about love and commitment was a lie? How do you explain that the man who taught her to ride a bike and walked her to school and scared away her teenage boyfriends had decided that 23 years of marriage wasn't worth fighting for? "Emma, sweetheart," I began, my voice breaking despite my efforts. "Your father and we're having some problems." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like eternity. "What kind of problems?" she asked quietly. He's moved out. There's someone else." I heard Emma's sharp intake of breath, followed by a string of words I'd never heard my daughter use before. "Someone else?" she said, her voice rising. "Are you kidding me? After everything you've done for him? After everything you sacrificed?" "Emma, please don't." "No, Mom. Don't you dare defend him. Don't you dare make excuses." I could hear the tears in her voice now, matching my own. "Who is she?" I hadn't planned to tell her about Jessica. Hadn't wanted to burden my daughter with the humiliating details of my husband's betrayal. But the pain was too fresh, too raw to contain. "Her name is Jessica. She's young, 26. The silence that followed was deafening. 26? Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "Mom, I'm 28. This woman is younger than I am. I hadn't thought about it that way. I'd been so focused on the age gap between Michael and Jessica that I hadn't considered how it would feel for our children to know their father was with someone closer to their age than to mine. "I'm coming home," Emma said firmly. "No, honey. You don't need to." "Yes, I do. You shouldn't be alone right now. And someone needs to talk some sense into Dad before he completely destroys everything." After I hung up with Emma, I called Jake at his college apartment. The conversation was shorter but no less devastating. My son, my baby boy who was about to graduate and start his own life, listened in stunned silence as I explained that his father had left. "I don't understand," he said finally. "You guys seemed fine at Christmas. I mean, you weren't all lovey-dovey or whatever, but you seemed solid. Like parents are supposed to be. Like parents are supposed to be." The phrase hit me like a physical blow. We had been solid, or at least I thought we were. We'd weathered financial stress, parenting challenges, career changes, and the gradual erosion of passion that comes with 2 decades of shared responsibility. I thought that was what love looked like after 23 years. Comfortable compatibility, shared history, the quiet intimacy of 2 people who knew each other's weaknesses and chose to stay anyway. But apparently, Michael had been longing for something else entirely, something that felt like those early days of romance, when love is all butterflies and possibility, rather than steady commitment and shared sacrifice. The days blurred together in a haze of grief and disbelief. I moved through the motions of living, showering, eating sporadically, checking email, but everything felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. Emma arrived 3 days after our phone call. bursting through the front door with the fierce determination of a warrior princess ready for battle. At 28, my daughter was everything I had once been: ambitious, passionate, uncompromising in her beliefs about right and wrong. She took one look at me, wrapped me in her arms, and let me cry against her shoulder like I hadn't done since I was younger than she was now. "Mom," she said, stroking my hair, "you don't deserve this." "You know that, right?" I wanted to agree with her, but part of me wondered if Michael was right. Maybe I had become too comfortable, too settled. Maybe I had stopped trying to be the woman he fell in love with and had become just a manager of our shared life, coordinating schedules, paying bills, maintaining the household machinery that kept our family functioning. Maybe I did deserve it, I said quietly. Maybe I stopped being interesting. Maybe I stopped being enough. Emma pulled back and looked at me with fierce eyes that reminded me so much of my own mother. "Don't you dare blame yourself for his choices," she said firmly. "Don't you dare make his selfishness your fault." That evening, Emma insisted we go through old photo albums together. She pulled box after box from the closet, spreading 23 years of memories across the living room floor like evidence in a case she was building. "Look at this," she said, holding up a photo from Jake's 10th birthday party. In the picture, Michael and I were laughing at something off camera, his arm around my waist, my head thrown back in genuine joy. We looked happy. We looked like we belonged together. "And this one," she continued, showing me a picture from our anniversary dinner 2 years ago. We were dressed up, sitting across from each other at a nice restaurant, toasting with wine glasses. Michael was looking at me with what appeared to be genuine affection, and I was smiling with the contentment of a woman who felt secure in her marriage. "These don't look like the photos of a woman who stopped being enough," Emma said pointedly. "We found hundreds of photos like that. Christmas mornings, family vacations, graduation ceremonies, birthday celebrations. In every single one, we looked like a family. Not a perfect family, but a real one. A family built on love and commitment and the daily choice to show up for each other." "When did it change?" I asked Emma, studying a photo from last summer's barbecue in our backyard. "When did he start looking at me and seeing failure instead of love?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, then said something that surprised me. "Maybe it didn't change. Mom. Maybe he's just convinced himself it did, so he could justify what he wanted to do anyway." I looked at my daughter, struck by her wisdom. When had she become so insightful about the complexities of adult relationships? "You think he planned this?" I asked. "I think he met someone who made him feel young and exciting again, and instead of remembering that those feelings always fade, he decided to blow up his life to chase them," she said. "And then he convinced himself that the problem was with you and what you'd become, not with him and what he was choosing." The next morning, Emma convinced me to get dressed and leave the house for the first time since Michael had left. We went to the little cafe downtown, where I used to meet friends before my social circle gradually shrunk to revolve around family obligations and Michael's career networking. As we sat with our coffee, Emma asked the question I'd been dreading. "Have you talked to Jake about this? Really talked to him?" I shook my head. "He's got finals coming up. Graduation is in 6 weeks. I don't want to ruin that for him. Mom, his family is falling apart. Don't you think he deserves to know what's really happening?" That afternoon, Jake drove down from his college town, arriving just as Emma and I were making dinner. My son had grown so much over the past 4 years, not just physically, though he'd shot up to 6'2" and filled out with the kind of lean muscle that came from years of high school athletics, but emotionally too. The boy who'd left for college was still there in his face, but there was something more mature in his eyes now, something that reminded me painfully of his father. We sat around the kitchen table where we'd shared so many family meals, and I told Jake everything. About Jessica, about Michael's reasons for leaving, about the devastating casualness with which he'd dismantled our life together. Jake listened in silence, his jaw clenched in a way that was pure Michael. When I finished, he pushed back from the table and walked to the window, staring out at the backyard where Michael had taught him to throw a football. where we'd hosted countless birthday parties and graduation celebrations. "I can't believe he's doing this to you," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "To us." "It's not about us, honey," I said, though the words felt like lies even as I spoke them. Sometimes adults just grow apart. Jake turned around, and I was startled to see tears in his eyes. "That's bullshit, Mom, and you know it," he said. "People don't just grow apart after 23 years. They make choices. And Dad chose to throw away everything we built together for some girl who's barely older than Emma." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of my life. Emma and Jake peppered me with questions I couldn't answer, expressed anger I was afraid to feel, and grieved for the family they thought they knew. We cried together, raged together, and tried to make sense of something that defied logic. It was Jake who finally asked the question that had been haunting me. "Mom, what are you going to do now?" I looked at my children, my beautiful, strong, compassionate children who had somehow turned out so much better than I'd dared to hope, and realized I had no idea how to answer. For 23 years, my identity had been built around being Michael's wife, Emma and Jake's mother, the keeper of our family's story. I was the one who remembered birthdays and anniversaries, who maintained relationships with extended family, who preserved traditions and created the sense of home that held us all together. Who was I without that role? What was left of Sarah when you stripped away wife and mother and family coordinator? "I don't know," I admitted. "I honestly don't know." That night, after Emma and Jake had gone to bed in their childhood rooms, I found myself standing in front of the mirror in my bathroom, really looking at myself for the first time in months. The woman looking back at me was 48 years old, with gray threads weaving through her brown hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of years of laughter and worry in equal measure. She looked tired, sad, older than her years, but she also looked familiar in a way that surprised me. Underneath the grief and shock, I could see traces of the woman I'd been before marriage and motherhood consumed my identity. The woman who'd painted portraits in college, who'd dreamed of traveling to Italy to study Renaissance art, who'd believed she could change the world through creativity and passion. When had I stopped seeing her? When had I allowed her to disappear so completely that even I forgot she existed? Michael had accused me of being comfortable with mediocrity, of choosing security over adventure. Maybe he was right, but not in the way he meant. Maybe I'd become so comfortable being defined by my relationships to other people that I'd forgotten how to be defined by my relationship to myself. The revelation should have been liberating, but instead it felt terrifying. At 48, was it too late to rediscover who I was beyond wife and mother? Was it possible to rebuild an identity that had been dormant for decades? Over the next few days, with Emma and Jake both staying at the house, I began to feel something I hadn't experienced in years: the luxury of being taken care of. My children cooked meals, handled phone calls from well-meaning friends and relatives, and created a protective bubble around me while I processed the devastation of my life imploding. It was during this time that I learned more about Jessica. Emma, with the investigative skills of her generation, had found Jessica's social media profiles within hours of learning her name. Against my better judgment, I found myself scrolling through photos of the woman who had stolen my husband. Jessica was beautiful in the way that 26-year-olds are beautiful, effortlessly, carelessly, without the weight of years or responsibility etched into her features. Her Instagram was filled with photos of exotic vacations, trendy restaurants, art gallery openings, and yoga poses on pristine beaches. She looked exactly like someone who believed you could have it all, because she'd never been forced to choose between competing priorities. In several recent photos, I could see Michael's hands or the edge of his profile, evidence of their relationship that felt like a knife twisting in my chest. There was one photo in particular, Jessica laughing at something off camera, her face glowing with the kind of joy that comes from new love, that made me close my laptop and cry until my chest ached. This was what Michael had chosen. This young, beautiful, carefree woman who saw him as an adventure rather than a responsibility, who brought excitement to his life, rather than the comfortable predictability of 2 decades together. I understood the appeal. I even understood why he'd convinced himself that leaving was the right choice. What I couldn't understand was how he'd managed to forget everything we'd built together, all the reasons he'd once loved me enough to promise forever. The breaking point came 2 weeks after Michael left, when he called to discuss practical matters. His voice on the phone was businesslike, detached, as if he were calling to schedule a dentist appointment rather than to dismantle a life we'd spent more than 2 decades building together. "We need to talk about the house," he said without preamble, "and the finances. My lawyer says—" "Your lawyer?" I interrupted, the words hitting me like a physical blow. "You already have a lawyer?" There was a pause, then a sigh. "Sarah, we both knew this was coming. We need to handle this properly, legally." "No, Michael. You knew this was coming. I thought we were going through a rough patch. I thought you were having some kind of midlife crisis that we'd work through together like we always have." "That's exactly the problem," he said, and I could hear frustration creeping into his carefully controlled tone. "You always think we can just work through everything, that love is enough to solve every problem. But sometimes things are just over." "Over?" I repeated, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles were white. 23 years is just over? Emma and Jake are just over? Everything we built together is just over? "The kids will adjust," he said. "They're adults. They'll understand eventually." "Will they?" I asked. "Because Jake can barely look at photos of you without crying, and Emma is so angry she's talking about not inviting you to her wedding when she gets married." Another pause. "Longer this time. She'll come around," he said, but I could hear uncertainty in his voice. "Maybe she will," I said. "But what if she doesn't? What if you've destroyed your relationship with your children for a woman who's never had to make a real sacrifice in her life? What if you've traded everything permanent for something temporary?" "Jessica isn't temporary," he said sharply. "This isn't some fling, Sarah. I love her. I love her." The words hung in the air between us like a death sentence. Not, "I don't love you anymore," or "I'm confused about my feelings." Just the simple, devastating truth. I love her. "What about me?" I whispered. "Did you ever love me? Really love me?" The silence stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. "Of course I loved you," he said finally. "I still do in a way, but it's not the same kind of love anymore. It's not alive. Not alive." There was that phrase again, the same one he'd used when he was packing his suitcase. As if our love had died without my noticing, as if 23 years of partnership and intimacy and shared dreams had somehow rotted away while I wasn't paying attention. "When did it die?" I asked. "When did I become so unbearable that you had to find someone else to feel alive?" "It wasn't about you being unbearable," he said, his voice softening slightly. "It was about us becoming comfortable, routine. We stopped dreaming together. Sarah, we stopped wanting things." "I wanted things," I said, thinking about the letter I'd found in the kitchen drawer, about all the dreams I'd carefully folded away. I wanted to paint again. I wanted to travel to Italy. I wanted to write that children's book I used to talk about. But there was never time, never money, never the right moment because we were always focused on your career, your dreams, your timeline. "That's not fair," he said. "I never asked you to give up your dreams." "You didn't have to ask," I said, feeling 23 years of buried resentment rising to the surface. "I gave them up because that's what you do when you love someone. You sacrifice for the good of the family. You put other people's needs first. You make compromises. And that's exactly what I don't want anymore," he said. "I don't want compromise. I don't want sacrifice. I want to feel excited about life again." The conversation ended badly, with both of us saying things we couldn't take back. After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen holding that old letter, wondering when love had become something Michael wanted to escape rather than something worth fighting for. That night, Emma found me crying over the photo albums again. "Mom," she said, sitting down beside me on the living room floor, "you have to stop torturing yourself with these." "I'm trying to figure out when it went wrong," I said. pointing to a photo from our 15th anniversary dinner. "Look at us here. We look happy. We look like we're in love." Emma studied the photo, then looked at me with an expression that was wise beyond her years. "Maybe it didn't go wrong," she said. "Maybe Dad just decided he wanted something different, and instead of dealing with that honestly, he convinced himself that what you had was broken." "But what if he's right?" I asked. "What if I did become boring and complacent? What if I stopped being the woman he fell in love with?" Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that changed everything. "Mom, I want you to think about something. You say you stopped being the woman Dad fell in love with. But when exactly was the last time he did something to make you feel like the woman he fell in love with?" The question hit me like lightning. When was the last time Michael had made me feel beautiful, desired, interesting? When had he last asked about my dreams, my thoughts, my hopes for the future that didn't revolve around family logistics? I thought back through recent years, searching for moments when Michael had seen me as Sarah the individual rather than Sarah the wife and mother. The exercise was more difficult than I'd expected. Our conversations had become increasingly focused on practical matters, schedules, finances, the children's needs. When had we stopped talking about books we'd read or movies that moved us or places we dreamed of visiting? When had we stopped asking each other the deep questions that couples ask when they're still curious about each other's inner lives? "I can't remember," I admitted to Emma. "I can't remember the last time he asked me about anything that wasn't related to family management." "Exactly," Emma said. "So maybe the problem wasn't that you stopped being interesting. Maybe the problem was that he stopped being interested." The insight was so simple and so profound that I felt something shift inside my chest. For weeks, I'd been accepting Michael's narrative that I had somehow failed as a wife, that I'd become too comfortable and predictable to inspire love. But what if the truth was more complicated than that? What if we'd both become lazy in different ways? What if I'd stopped nurturing my own dreams and interests, while he'd stopped nurturing his curiosity about mine? What if our marriage had died not because I wasn't enough, but because we'd both stopped putting in the effort required to keep love alive? The realization should have been comforting, but instead it made me angry. Angrier than I'd been since the day Michael left. If our marriage had problems, why hadn't he talked to me about them? Why hadn't he suggested counseling or planned a romantic getaway, or simply asked me what I needed to feel alive again? Why had his first instinct been to find someone new, rather than to work with the woman who'd stood by him for 23 years? The answer, I realized, was simple. Because fixing our marriage would have required effort and patience and the kind of long-term commitment that middle-aged love demands. Finding Jessica had been easier. It was easier to start over with someone who didn't know his flaws, who hadn't seen him at his worst, who still looked at him with the wonder of new love. It was easier to be the exciting older man in a young woman's life than to be the husband who worked at making his marriage passionate again. Michael had chosen the easy path, and in doing so, he'd thrown away something precious and irreplaceable. The anger felt good. It felt clean and powerful and so much better than the crushing self-doubt I'd been carrying. For the first time since Michael left, I felt something other than grief and confusion. I felt fury. That fury carried me through the next several weeks as I began the practical work of rebuilding my life. I found a divorce attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia who listened to my story with the kind of professional sympathy that made me feel less alone. I started going through our finances, separating 23 years of intertwined assets and debts. The process was exhausting and heartbreaking, reducing the intimacy of marriage to a series of legal documents and financial calculations. But it was also empowering in a way I hadn't expected. For the first time in decades, I was making decisions based solely on what I wanted and needed, without considering how they would affect Michael or fit into his plans. Emma stayed for 3 weeks, using her remote work arrangement to support me through the worst of the initial shock. Jake came home every weekend, and together my children helped me begin to envision a life that didn't revolve around being Michael's wife. "What do you want to do now, Mom?" Jake asked one Saturday afternoon as we cleaned out the garage. sorting through boxes of family memorabilia that now felt like artifacts from someone else's life. It was the same question he'd asked weeks earlier, but this time I had a different answer. "I want to paint again," I said, surprised by the certainty in my voice. "I want to set up an easel in the sunroom and paint like I used to. I want to take that trip to Italy I always talked about. I want to write that children's book. I want to figure out who I am when I'm not managing everyone else's life." Jake smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him since learning about the divorce. "That sounds amazing. Mom, when do you start?" I looked around our garage, filled with 23 years of accumulated family life, and felt something that had been dormant for so long, I'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Excitement about the future. "I think I already have," I said. That afternoon, I drove to the art supply store for the first time in over 2 decades. Walking through the aisles of brushes and paints and canvases, I felt like a desert traveler stumbling upon an oasis. Colors seemed more vivid, possibilities more infinite. I bought everything I needed to set up a small studio in the sunroom: an easel, canvases, a basic set of acrylic paints, brushes in various sizes. The teenage cashier, probably close to Jessica's age, looked at my purchases with interest. "Starting something new?" she asked. "Actually," I said, "I'm starting something old. Something I used to do before life got in the way." "That's cool," she said. "My grandmother just started pottery classes after my grandfather died. She says it's like finding a part of herself she thought was gone forever." Finding a part of herself she thought was gone forever. The phrase stayed with me as I drove home, my car filled with art supplies and possibility. That evening, I set up my easel in the sunroom where afternoon light streamed through the windows, creating the kind of natural lighting I'd dreamed of when I was 25 and thought I'd become a professional artist. I squeezed paint onto a palette for the first time in over 20 years, mixed colors with the instinctive knowledge that came flooding back like muscle memory. And then I began to paint. I started with abstract shapes, just color and movement and emotion flowing onto the canvas without plan or purpose. It felt like prayer, like meditation, like coming home to a language I'd forgotten I spoke fluently. As I painted, I thought about Michael and Jessica, about the life they were building together while I rebuilt mine alone. I thought about Emma and Jake, about the family we'd been and the family we'd become. I thought about dreams deferred and second chances and the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of reinvention at 48. But mostly, I just painted. And for the first time in months, I felt like myself again. The painting I created that first night was nothing like the careful, realistic portraits I'd done in college. This was raw, emotional, alive with color and movement that seemed to pulse with their own energy. Looking at it, I could see my grief and anger and hope all swirled together in brushstrokes that felt like pieces of my soul made visible. Emma found me in the sunroom the next morning, still in yesterday's clothes, surrounded by canvases covered in paint. "Mom," she said, her voice filled with wonder, "these are incredible." I looked around at what I'd created during my night of artistic resurrection. A dozen small canvases, each one exploring different emotions through color and texture. They weren't masterpieces, but they were honest. They were me, in a way I hadn't been me in decades. "I forgot how good this feels," I said, flexing fingers that were sore from gripping brushes for hours. "I forgot how painting makes everything else quieter." Emma hugged me, and I could feel her relief that I was beginning to find my way back to something that looked like joy. "Promise me you won't stop," she said. "Promise me you won't let anyone convince you that this isn't important enough to prioritize." I looked at my daughter, so beautiful and fierce and wise, and made a promise that felt like a vow. "I promise," I said. "I promise I won't disappear again." Over the next several weeks, as spring turned toward summer, I fell into a new rhythm. I worked my part-time job at the nonprofit, handled the legal and financial aspects of the divorce, and spent every spare moment in my makeshift studio. I painted landscapes from memory, portraits of Emma and Jake, abstract expressions of emotions I was still learning to name. The work was therapeutic, but it was more than that. It was reclamation. Every brushstroke was a declaration that I existed beyond my roles as wife and mother, that there were parts of me that had nothing to do with Michael or anyone else. I also began writing again, starting with journal entries that gradually evolved into the children's book I'd talked about for years. The story that emerged was about a woman who loses her way in a dark forest and has to learn to trust her own instincts to find her way home. It wasn't subtle, but it was true. My friends from work began stopping by to see my paintings, and their enthusiasm surprised me. Jennifer, my boss, was particularly encouraging. "Sarah, these are really good," she said, studying a canvas I'd painted of the view from our kitchen window. "Have you thought about showing them somewhere?" The idea of showing my work publicly hadn't occurred to me. I was painting for myself, for the pure joy of creating something beautiful from nothing. But Jennifer's suggestion planted a seed that began to grow. Meanwhile, Michael's new life with Jessica was apparently not the fairy tale he'd imagined. Emma, who had reluctantly agreed to have dinner with her father, reported that he seemed stressed and uncertain in ways she'd never seen before. "He kept asking about you," she told me after one of these awkward encounters. "Not directly, but he wanted to know how you were doing without seeming like he cared." "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him you were painting again," Emma said with a satisfied smile. "I told him you seemed happier than you'd been in years." It wasn't entirely true. I was still grieving, still angry, still struggling with the practical and emotional challenges of rebuilding my life. But there was truth in it too. I was discovering parts of myself that felt vibrant and alive, aspects of my personality that had been dormant so long I'd forgotten they existed. The real test came when Michael called to discuss Jake's graduation ceremony. "We need to coordinate," he said, his voice carrying the kind of forced casualness that suggested he'd rehearsed this conversation. "I don't want things to be awkward for Jake." "Awkward for Jake?" I repeated. "You mean like having his father bring his girlfriend who's younger than his sister to his college graduation? That kind of awkward?" "Jessica is important to me," Michael said defensively. "I'd like her to be there." The old Sarah would have swallowed her objection, would have prioritized everyone else's comfort over her own feelings. But the woman I was becoming had different priorities. "Then you'll need to sit separately," I said calmly. "Jake asked me to save seats with Emma and my parents. There won't be room for Jessica." "Sarah, that's not fair." "What's not fair is you expecting me to make space for your girlfriend at our son's graduation," I interrupted. "What's not fair is you thinking I should accommodate the woman you left me for so that you can feel comfortable about your choices." The silence on Michael's end of the call was telling. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said finally. "But you did," I replied. "You hurt me, and you hurt our children, and you damaged something that took 23 years to build. And now you want me to pretend that's okay so that you don't have to feel bad about it." "I just want us to be able to coexist peacefully," he said. "We can coexist peacefully," I said. "But peaceful doesn't mean I have to make your new relationship comfortable for you. You made your choice, Michael. Now you get to live with the consequences." Jake's graduation was both wonderful and heartbreaking. Watching my youngest child receive his diploma, seeing the pride and joy on his face as he walked across that stage, I felt the complicated mixture of triumph and loss that defines so many parenting moments. Michael was there, sitting several rows behind us with Jessica, who looked exactly like what she was, a young woman attending her boyfriend's son's graduation ceremony. She seemed nervous and out of place, which gave me a petty satisfaction I wasn't entirely proud of. After the ceremony, during the awkward milling around as families took photos and said goodbyes, Michael approached me. "Sarah," he said, "you look good." It was true. I'd lost weight without trying, and the creative work was giving me a sense of vitality I hadn't felt in years. I was wearing a dress Emma had helped me pick out, something more stylish and fitted than my usual wardrobe of practical clothing chosen for invisibility rather than beauty. "Thank you," I said simply. Emma tells me you're painting again, he said, and I could hear something in his voice I couldn't quite identify. Wistfulness? Regret? I am, I said. I'm remembering who I used to be before I forgot. We stood there for a moment. 23 years of shared history creating a complicated tension between us. Behind him, I could see Jessica hovering uncertainly, probably wondering who this woman was who commanded so much of her boyfriend's attention. I'm glad, Michael said finally. I always loved your paintings. Always loved. Past tense. As if my art, like our marriage, was something he'd once cherished but had outgrown. That night, back at the hotel where Emma, Jake, and I were staying, my children and I had the kind of honest conversation that would have been impossible when we were all still pretending to be an intact family. Mom, Jake said, I need to tell you something. I'm not ready to have a relationship with Dad's girlfriend. I don't know if I'll ever be ready. You don't have to be, I said. You don't owe anyone forgiveness or acceptance just because it would make things easier for them. But what if Dad makes me choose? Emma asked. What if he says I can't have a relationship with him unless I accept Jessica? I looked at my children, both of them strong and kind and wiser than they should have to be at their ages, and felt a fierce protectiveness that surprised me with its intensity. Then you choose what feels right for you, I said, and whatever you choose, I'll support you. Your relationship with your father is separate from my relationship with him. I will never put you in the middle of this, and I won't let anyone else do it either. The conversation continued late into the night, covering everything from practical concerns about holidays and family gatherings to deeper questions about love and commitment and what they wanted for their own future relationships. I used to think you and Dad had the perfect marriage, Jake said at one point. You guys never fought in front of us. You seemed to work as a team. You made everything look easy. Maybe that was part of the problem, I said. Maybe we were so focused on looking like we had it all figured out that we stopped doing the real work of staying connected. Do you regret it? Emma asked. The marriage, I mean. Do you wish you'd done things differently? It was a question I'd been asking myself for months, and I still wasn't sure I had a complete answer. I regret that it ended, I said finally. I regret that your father and I couldn't find a way to grow together instead of growing apart. But I don't regret the marriage itself. It gave me you two, and it gave me 23 years of experiences, good and bad, that made me who I am. Even now? Jake asked. Even knowing how it ended? I thought about the woman I'd been when I married Michael. Young, idealistic, certain that love could conquer anything. I thought about the woman I was becoming. Older, wiser, more cautious, but also more aware of my own strength. Even now, I said. Because the alternative would have been never knowing what it felt like to build a life with someone, never having you two, never learning that I could survive something I thought would destroy me. Summer brought unexpected opportunities. A local gallery owner saw some of my work at a coffee shop where Jennifer had convinced me to display a few pieces, and she asked if I'd be interested in participating in a group show featuring local artists. The idea terrified me. My paintings were so personal, so raw with emotion and experience. Displaying them publicly felt like hanging my heart on a wall for strangers to judge, but it also felt like the next step in becoming the person I was meant to be. I selected 12 pieces for the show, a mix of landscapes, abstracts, and portraits that told the story of my journey from devastation to renewal. Standing in the gallery on opening night, watching people respond to my work with interest and appreciation, I felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with anyone else's expectations or needs. Michael showed up, which surprised me. He came alone, which surprised me more. He moved through the gallery slowly, studying each of my paintings with an intensity that reminded me of the young man I'd fallen in love with in college. When he reached the centerpiece of my collection, a self-portrait I'd painted after one of my worst days, showing a woman emerging from darkness into light, he stood there for a long time without speaking. Finally, he approached me. "Sarah?" he said. "These are extraordinary. I had no idea you were capable of work this powerful." His words should have felt like validation, but instead they made me sad. How had we lived together for 23 years without him knowing what I was capable of? How had I allowed myself to become so invisible, even to the person who should have known me best? "I didn't know either," I said honestly. "I forgot. I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time since he'd left, he sounded like he meant it. "I'm sorry for a lot of things." I looked at my ex-husband. We'd been officially divorced for 2 months by then, and felt something I hadn't expected: forgiveness. Not because he deserved it, but because carrying anger was exhausting, and I had better things to do with my energy. "I know you are," I said, "but sorry doesn't undo the choices we made." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." We stood there for a moment, surrounded by art that had emerged from the ashes of our marriage, and I realized that this was probably the most honest conversation we'd had in years. "How are things with Jessica?" I asked, genuinely curious. Michael was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. "Complicated," he said finally. "Turns out real life intrudes even on fairy tales." I wanted to ask what he meant, but I recognized that it wasn't my place anymore. His relationship with Jessica, like my relationship with painting, was something that belonged to his new life rather than our shared past. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I said, and meant it. "I think I already did," he said, gesturing toward my paintings. "It just wasn't what I expected." That fall, something remarkable happened. My children's book was accepted for publication by a small press that specialized in books dealing with difficult life transitions. The advance wasn't large, but holding the contract in my hands felt like victory. Emma and Jake were both thriving in their post-graduation lives. Emma had been promoted at her design firm and was in a serious relationship with a man who adored her independence and ambition. Jake had landed a job at a nonprofit that worked with underprivileged youth, channeling his natural empathy and leadership skills into meaningful work. Watching my children build lives that reflected their values and dreams, I felt the deep satisfaction of a job well done. Whatever mistakes Michael and I had made as a couple, we'd raised 2 extraordinary human beings who knew how to love and be loved, how to work hard and stay true to themselves. I was planning my trip to Italy, finally at 50, when Michael called with news that changed everything. "Sarah," he said, his voice shaky in a way I hadn't heard since his father died 5 years earlier. "I need to tell you something. Jessica and we're over." I sat down slowly, processing this information that I'd secretly expected, but never quite believed would happen. "What happened?" I asked. "Everything," he said. "Nothing. We wanted different things. She wanted someone who could give her the life she dreamed of, and I don't know what I wanted, but it wasn't what we had. I'm sorry," I said, and realized I meant it. Whatever anger I'd carried toward Jessica had long since faded into something more like pity. She'd been young and naive enough to believe that love could overcome any obstacle, including the inherent instability of a relationship built on betrayal. "Are you?" Michael asked. I considered the question seriously. Was I sorry that his grand adventure had ended in disappointment? Was I sorry that the woman who'd stolen my husband had discovered that stolen things rarely bring lasting happiness? "I'm sorry that you're in pain," I said finally. "I'm sorry that it didn't work out the way you hoped. I'm sorry that people got hurt for nothing." "Sarah," he said, and I could hear tears in his voice. "I made the biggest mistake of my life. I threw away everything that mattered for something that was never real. Is there any chance, any possibility that we could—" "No," I said gently but firmly. "No, Michael. There isn't." The silence that followed was profound. "But I love you," he said. "I never stopped loving you. I just got confused about what love was supposed to feel like." "I believe you," I said. "But love isn't enough." It never was. Love is what you start with, but it's not what sustains a marriage. Trust sustains a marriage. Commitment sustains a marriage. The choice to keep choosing each other, even when it's hard, even when someone younger and more exciting comes along. that's what sustains a marriage. I could choose you now, he said desperately. I could commit now. I know what I lost. Yes, you do, I agreed. But I know what I found. I found myself, Michael. I found the woman I was before I defined myself entirely through my relationship to you. And I'm not willing to lose her again. What if I promised? You promised before, I reminded him. In front of our families and friends and God, you promised to love me and only me until death do us part. And you broke that promise for someone who made you feel young and exciting. What makes you think a new promise would mean more than the old one? Michael was crying now, and part of me wanted to comfort him the way I had for 23 years. But I was no longer his wife, no longer responsible for managing his emotions or fixing his mistakes. I can't believe I destroyed everything for nothing, he said. You didn't destroy it for nothing, I said. You destroyed it because you thought something else would make you happier. You were wrong, but that doesn't make your reasons nothing. It makes them selfish, but not nothing. How can you be so calm about this? He asked. How can you be so forgiving? I looked around my sunroom, filled with paintings and works in progress, evidence of the creative life I'd reclaimed from the ashes of our marriage. I thought about the trip to Italy I was planning, the book that would be published in the spring, the sense of possibility that now defined my days instead of resignation. Because being angry with you was killing me, I said. Because forgiveness isn't about you deserving it. It's about me deserving peace. We talked for another hour, covering 23 years of marriage and 2 years of divorce, trying to make sense of how we'd gotten from the hopeful young couple in our wedding photos to 2 middle-aged people who'd hurt each other so deeply. Will you ever be able to love someone again? Michael asked toward the end of our conversation. I don't know, I said honestly, but I'm not looking for someone to complete me anymore. I'm looking for someone to complement the person I've become, someone who sees me as Sarah first, not as someone's wife or mother. I wish I had seen you that way, he said. I wish I had demanded to be seen that way, I replied. I wish I had never allowed myself to disappear so completely into our marriage that I forgot I existed as an individual. When we finally hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 2 years. Closure. Not the neat, tidy resolution of a fairy tale, but the messy, complicated understanding that comes from finally accepting that some things can't be fixed, only grieved and released. That night I painted until dawn. The canvas that emerged was unlike anything I'd done before, a portrait of a woman walking away from a burning house, her face turned toward the sunrise. She wasn't running from the fire. She was walking deliberately, purposefully, carrying something precious in her hands that she'd saved from the flames. Looking at it in the morning light, I realized it was the most honest self-portrait I'd ever created. 6 months later, I was in Florence, standing in front of Botticelli's Birth of Venus with tears streaming down my face. Not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. My Italian adventure was everything I'd dreamed it would be, and more. I spent mornings sketching in the Uffizi, afternoons exploring churches filled with Renaissance art, evenings writing in sidewalk cafes with views of the Arno River. I felt connected to something larger than my own small life, part of a tradition of artists and dreamers who'd found ways to transform pain into beauty. On my last day in Florence, I received a message from Emma with a photo attached. She was holding a copy of my published children's book, beaming with pride. "So proud of you, Mom," the message read. "You're proof that it's never too late to bloom. Never too late to bloom." I thought about that phrase as I sat by the river, watching the sun set over the city where Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci had once walked. At 50, I was finally becoming the woman I was meant to be all along. My phone buzzed with another message, this one from Jake. "Dad asked me to tell you congratulations on the book. He bought a copy. He says he's proud of you." I stared at the message for a long time, feeling the complicated mix of emotions that Michael still inspired. Sadness for what we'd lost, gratitude for what we'd shared, and a kind of peaceful acceptance of how our story had ended. I typed back, "Tell him thank you. and tell him I hope he finds his way to happiness too. Because that's what forgiveness really means. Not pretending that the hurt never happened, but choosing to wish the person who hurt you well anyway. Choosing to release them from your anger so you can be free to live your own life fully. As the sun disappeared behind the Florentine hills, I made a decision. I would stay in Italy for another month. I would paint the Tuscan countryside, write in cafes overlooking medieval squares, and allow myself to be a woman whose life was defined by her own choices rather than her relationships to other people. For the first time in my adult life, I had no one to check with, no one whose schedule I needed to accommodate, no one whose needs had to be considered before my own. The freedom was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. That night, I video called Emma and Jake from my small apartment overlooking the Duomo. "Mom, you look incredible," Emma said. "Like, seriously, you're glowing." "Italy agrees with me," I said, gesturing toward the window where the cathedral dome was lit against the dark sky. "When are you coming home?" Jake asked. "I'm not sure," I said, surprising myself with the answer. "I'm thinking about staying a bit longer." "Good," Emma said firmly. "Stay as long as you want. Stay forever if it makes you happy." As we talked about their lives, their work, their relationships, I realized that my children no longer needed me to be their stable home base. They'd become adults who could support themselves emotionally and practically. They loved me, but they didn't need me to define myself through that love anymore. It was both liberating and melancholy, the natural evolution of parenthood that I'd been too afraid to acknowledge while I was still married to their father. After we hung up, I stood on my small balcony looking out over the city where countless artists had found inspiration for centuries. I thought about Michael, probably alone in the house we'd shared, surrounded by rooms full of memories and regrets. I thought about Jessica, young and resilient, probably already moving on to her next adventure with the confidence of someone who still believed in fairy tale endings, and I thought about myself, a 50-year-old woman who'd lost everything she thought. She wanted and discovered everything she actually needed. The phone rang. Michael's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered not answering. But something made me pick up. "Sarah." His voice was small across the distance. "I know I don't have the right to ask this, but are you happy?" I looked out at the ancient city spread below me, thought about the paintings I'd created, the book I'd written, the woman I'd become. "Yes," I said. "I really am." "Good," he said, and I could hear him crying. "That's good. That's what I wanted, is it?" I asked gently. "Because it seems like what you wanted was for me to be miserable so you could feel better about your choices." "Maybe," he admitted. "Maybe at first. But now I just want you to be okay. I want to know that I didn't destroy everything good about you when I destroyed us." "You didn't destroy me, Michael," I said. "You broke my heart, but you didn't destroy me. Hearts heal. People grow. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the doorway to the best thing that could happen to you." We talked for an hour, saying goodbye in a way we'd never been able to before. Not the angry, bitter goodbye of divorce proceedings, but the sad, grateful goodbye of two people who'd loved each other imperfectly and were finally ready to let each other go. When I hung up, I felt lighter than I had in years. I stayed in Italy for 2 more months, painting and writing and discovering parts of myself I'd never known existed. When I finally returned home, it was to a life that looked nothing like the one I'd left behind, but felt infinitely more authentic. Emma met me at the airport, and the first thing she said was, "Mom, you look like yourself again." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean, you look like the person you were meant to be," she said. "Before you got lost in being everybody else's everything." That evening, unpacking in my house that no longer felt haunted by Michael's absence, I found another letter tucked into my suitcase. This one was from me to me, written on my last night in Florence. "Dear Sarah, remember this feeling. Remember what it's like to wake up excited about the day ahead, to make decisions based on what brings you joy rather than what's expected of you. Remember that you are enough, exactly as you are, without needing to be everything to everyone. You spent 23 years being half of a whole, and then 2 years learning to be whole on your own. Don't ever forget that the most important relationship you have is with yourself. The woman who left for Italy was broken and angry and afraid. The woman returning is none of those things. She is an artist, a writer, a mother, a friend. And all of those roles are chosen rather than imposed. Michael wanted a younger woman to make him feel alive. He never understood that feeling alive isn't about the person you're with. It's about the person you choose to be. You chose to be magnificent. Love yourself as. I read my own words. I realized that my story wasn't really about Michael leaving me for someone younger. It wasn't about betrayal or divorce or middle-aged heartbreak. It was about a woman who lost herself so completely in loving other people that she forgot she was worth loving for who she was, not just for what she could provide. It was about learning that the most devastating losses can become the most liberating beginnings. It was about discovering that sometimes the person who abandons you does you the greatest favor of your life. They force you to save yourself. Michael had wanted to feel alive again, so he'd left me for Jessica. But in the end, I was the one who came alive. I was the one who learned to dream again, to create again, to see possibilities where I'd once seen only obligations. My husband had wanted a younger woman, and he'd gotten exactly what he'd asked for, along with all the complications and disappointments that come with trying to build something permanent on the unstable foundation of someone else's identity crisis. I'd given him a lesson he'd never forget. That leaving someone who truly loves you doesn't make you young again. It just makes you alone. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it sets free the person you left behind to become who they were always meant to be. As I hung my paintings back on the walls of my home now, I thought about the message I wanted to leave with anyone who might hear this story. Love is not about disappearing into someone else's life. Love is not about sacrificing everything you are for everything they want you to be. Love is not about accepting less than you deserve because you're afraid of being alone. Real love, the kind that lasts, the kind that sustains you through decades of ordinary days and extraordinary challenges, is about two whole people choosing to build something together without losing themselves in the process. I'd learned that lesson too late to save my marriage, but not too late to save myself, and in the end, saving myself turned out to be the most important thing I'd ever done. The woman who'd once been so afraid of being alone that she'd accepted being invisible had learned the difference between solitude and loneliness. I was alone now, but I wasn't lonely. I was complete. Michael had wanted someone who would make him feel young and alive and full of possibilities. Instead, he'd created someone who actually was all of those things. The irony was exquisite. The lesson was complete, and the woman who emerged from the ashes of that 23-year marriage was finally, beautifully, uncompromisingly herself. That was my gift to him in the end. Not the lesson I'd intended to teach, but the one he needed to learn, that you can't find yourself in someone else's reflection. You can only find yourself by becoming brave enough to look in the mirror and love what you see there. I looked in my mirror now and saw an artist, a writer, a woman who'd traveled alone to Italy and painted sunsets over the Arno River. I saw someone who'd survived betrayal and emerged stronger, who'd lost everything she thought she wanted and found everything she actually needed. I saw someone who was finally, completely herself. And for the first time in 50 years, that was more than enough.